In the autumn of 1887, in a quiet Montana valley where winters were feared more than drought, Samuel Garrett lived an ordinary life by every outward measure. His barn stood like dozens of others scattered across the land, built from rough timber, its roof patched and repaired many times over the years. Hay bales leaned against one wall, tools hung from nails, and snow would soon cover everything in white. To anyone passing by, there was nothing unusual about Samuel Garrett or his farm. But beneath that barn floor, hidden from sight and from judgment, something remarkable was slowly taking shape. Samuel had spent years working in copper mines before he ever owned land. Those years underground were hard, dark, and dangerous, but they taught him something that stayed with him long after he left. Deep below the surface, the temperature never changed. Summer heat never reached him, and winter cold never followed. The rock walls stayed cool and steady every day of the year. While other men cursed the mines and dreamed of sunlight, Samuel quietly observed. He noticed how the earth insulated itself, how depth created stability, how the ground seemed to exist in a world separate from the seasons above. At the time, it was just an observation. Years later, it would become the reason his family survived winter in comfort. After leaving the mines, Samuel bought land with the money he had saved. He married Margaret, raised 3 children, and built a solid cabin by hand. By local standards, it was a good home. Thick pine logs, a stone chimney, tight-fitting doors. But Montana winters did not care how hard a man worked or how well he built. Each year, the cold came harder than expected. Wind slipped through the smallest cracks. Firewood vanished faster than it could be replaced. Nights were the worst. Fires died down. Ice formed inside windows. Children slept fully dressed beneath piles of blankets, their breath visible in the dark. One winter nearly took Samuel's youngest son. James developed a deep cough that worsened every night. The doctor arrived late, as he always did, and said what everyone already knew. The cold weakened children. That was the moment something shifted inside Samuel. He realized that no matter how much wood he burned or how many cracks he sealed, he was still fighting winter on its own terms. And winter always won that spring. As snow melted and the ground softened, Samuel remembered the mines. He remembered the steady warmth of the earth. 6 feet down, the temperature never froze. The ground held a constant warmth that required no fuel, no effort, no fighting. While his neighbors prepared for winter the same way their fathers had, Samuel chose a different path. He did not announce his plan. He did not argue with anyone. He simply began digging beneath his barn. Every day after chores, Samuel took his pick and shovel and disappeared into the barn. He dug slowly, carefully, hauling dirt out at night and spreading it far from the house so no one would notice. Margaret watched but did not interfere. She trusted her husband, even though she did not fully understand what he was building. The children sensed something important was happening but asked no questions. In a place where survival depended on minding your own business, Samuel's silence drew little attention at first. The shelter took shape over the summer. Samuel dug down 6 feet, deep enough to reach stable earth below the frost line. He carved out a room 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. He lined the walls with stone gathered from his land, fitting each piece carefully, using clay as mortar. He built thick walls to hold heat and allow just enough breath to prevent moisture. The floor was layered with gravel and river stone for drainage, topped with flat limestone slabs that would absorb and release warmth slowly. The barn floor above became the ceiling, reinforced with extra beams and insulated with clay, straw, and sawdust. Ventilation was the most delicate part. Samuel knew fresh air was essential, but heat loss could not be allowed. He built a narrow air shaft that ran up through the barn wall and exited outside, hidden from view. Inside the chamber, he installed a simple damper that could be adjusted depending on conditions. For heat, he built a small fire pit, nothing like the roaring fireplaces in cabins. The flue ran sideways beneath the barn floor before exiting, allowing heat to soak into the surrounding earth and stone before escaping. By autumn, the shelter was complete. From above, no one could tell anything had changed. The barn looked the same. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney as usual. When Samuel mentioned his plan to use the underground space in winter, neighbors laughed. They called it foolish, dangerous, unhealthy. Some said the barn would collapse. Others said moisture and sickness would kill his family faster than cold ever could. Even Margaret had doubts, but Samuel tested the shelter himself during the first cold nights. While the cabin dropped below 50 degrees with a fire burning, the underground chamber stayed comfortably above 50 with no fire at all. When winter arrived in full force, Samuel moved his family underground. He did not abandon the cabin entirely. Fires still burned there during the day to avoid suspicion. But at night and during the coldest stretches, the family lived below the barn. The difference was immediate. A small fire raised the temperature into the low 60s and held it there for hours. The stone walls radiated warmth long after the fire died. The floor stayed warm under bare feet. There were no drafts, no freezing corners, no ice on the walls. Outside, the valley suffered. Chimneys failed. Firewood ran out. Families burned green wood and filled their homes with smoke. Children grew sick. Nights became battles fought hour by hour. Inside the underground shelter, Samuel's children slept peacefully. Margaret worked without numb fingers. The air stayed dry and clean. Wood use dropped to a fraction of what it had been before. No one noticed at first. From the outside, the Garrett farm looked quiet, almost abandoned. That silence drew curiosity. One neighbor finally came to check, worried that something was wrong. What he found changed everything. Warm air rising from beneath the barn, children laughing, a family living comfortably underground while the rest of the valley froze. Word spread quickly. Skepticism turned into disbelief, then into acceptance. Men brought thermometers. Builders measured walls. Everyone saw the same thing. While cabins struggled to hold warmth, the shelter stayed steady and warm with minimal effort. Data replaced opinion. Numbers replaced pride. Soon, others began digging. Not everyone built the same design, but the principle remained. Get below the frost line. Insulate the ceiling. Use stone and earth as thermal mass. Work with the ground instead of fighting the cold. Families who copied the idea used less wood, stayed healthier, and slept through the night without fear. By the end of winter, the valley had changed. What began as one man's quiet project became a shared lesson. Samuel Garrett did not invent warmth or shelter. He simply remembered something the earth had always offered. The ground beneath their feet had never been cold. They just hadn't thought to listen, and when spring finally came, people no longer laughed at the barn that hid a shelter below. They asked questions. They took notes. They planned. Because one farmer had proven that survival did not always depend on working harder. Sometimes, it depended on understanding what was already there. Spring did not arrive all at once that year. It came slowly, reluctantly, as if winter was unwilling to release its grip on the valley. Snow lingered in shaded places well into April, and cold nights still crept in after warm afternoons. But people could feel that something had changed. Not just in the weather, but in themselves. The winter of 1887 had tested everyone, yet it had also taught them something new, something unexpected. For the first time, they knew winter did not have to be fought in the same exhausting way it always had. Samuel Garrett did not talk much about what he had done. He answered questions when asked, but he never boasted. He never said, "I told you so." He returned to his daily routines, tending animals, repairing fences, planting when the ground finally allowed it. But his barn was no longer just a barn in the eyes of the valley. It was proof. Quiet, undeniable proof that the old ways were not the only ways. Men who had burned themselves out chopping wood all winter now measured their remaining piles and realized how close they had come to disaster. Women remembered the sound of children coughing in the night and compared it to the calm warmth they had felt inside Samuel's underground chamber. Conversations changed. Instead of asking how much wood someone had left, people began asking how deep you needed to dig to reach stable ground. They spoke about stone thickness and airflow instead of chimney height and firebox size. Samuel noticed the change most clearly in how people listened. Before winter, when he spoke about earth temperature and thermal mass, faces had been polite but distant. Now, when he explained the same ideas, people leaned in. They asked him to repeat details. They asked him to draw diagrams again. They asked what mistakes he had made so they could avoid them. Knowledge that had once sounded strange now sounded practical, even necessary. Some families began digging as soon as the ground softened. They worked cautiously, learning from Samuel's example but adapting to their own needs. One man dug too shallow and learned quickly that frost still reached him. Another failed to drain properly and dealt with moisture until he corrected it. These early mistakes became lessons shared openly. What mattered was not perfection, but improvement. Even shelters that were not as warm as Samuel's were warmer than cabins alone. Margaret Garrett watched this change quietly. All winter, she had endured the looks, the whispers, the concern disguised as kindness. Now those same women came to her for advice. They asked how the children had stayed healthy, how the air stayed fresh, whether it ever felt dark or heavy underground. Margaret answered honestly. She spoke about the peace of sleeping without shivering, about being able to cook without rushing back to the fire, about the relief of hearing her children breathe easily through the night. She also spoke about fear. She admitted that at first, she had been afraid. Afraid of collapse, of sickness, of trusting something that went against everything she had been taught. That honesty mattered. It helped others understand that this was not reckless bravery. It was careful thinking, tested step by step. The children adjusted more easily than anyone. For them, the underground chamber was not strange. It was warm, safe, and steady. They played on the stone floor, carved wood at the table, read by lamplight without drafts flickering the flame. Elizabeth later said that winter felt shorter underground, as if the cold outside belonged to another world entirely. William liked how quiet it was. James, who had once been sick so often, simply thrived. As the years passed, the memory of that winter did not fade. It became a reference point. People spoke of winters as before the barn and after the barn. The idea of using the earth itself for warmth spread slowly beyond the valley. Travelers carried the story with them. Some exaggerated it. Some simplified it. But the core truth remained. The ground held warmth, and someone had finally used it wisely. Samuel never patented anything. He never wrote a guidebook. He believed that knowledge should move freely, especially knowledge that could keep children alive. When asked why he had not built a larger underground home instead of a shelter, he answered simply that he did not need more space, only better conditions. Comfort did not require luxury. It required understanding. Over time, the barn shelter became less of a secret. Samuel eventually built a more permanent underground living space connected to the cabin. Others did the same. Some families used underground rooms only during the coldest months. Others expanded them into root cellars, workshops, even sleeping quarters. The design evolved, but the principle stayed the same. Below the surface, the earth offered stability in a world of extremes. Looking back, people realized that the idea had always been there. Indigenous communities had long understood the value of earth-sheltered living. Root cellars, sod houses, dugouts, these were not new inventions. What Samuel had done was remember something that had been forgotten, something ignored in the rush to build upward instead of downward. The winter of 1887 became part of local history, told and retold by fires that burned a little smaller, in homes that stayed a little warmer. Children who grew up hearing the story did not laugh at the idea of digging for warmth. They accepted it as common sense. The earth was not the enemy. It was protection. Samuel Garrett lived many more years. He never considered himself extraordinary. He believed he had simply paid attention when others had not. When asked what lesson winter had taught him, he answered in plain words. "You can't fight nature forever," he said. "But if you understand it, you don't have to." And long after the barn weathered and the valley changed, that lesson remained buried beneath the ground, waiting for the next generation to uncover it again. As the years passed, people who had once mocked Samuel Garrett slowly forgot that they had ever laughed. Memory has a way of softening embarrassment, especially when survival is involved. What remained instead was respect, and not the loud kind. It was the quiet respect given to someone who had been right when being right mattered. The valley did not suddenly turn into a place of underground homes, but the idea of using the earth was no longer strange. It became part of how people thought. Winters still came hard. Snow still piled high against doors. Wind still screamed through the valley like it always had. But the fear changed. People no longer felt trapped by the cold in the same way. Those who had built earth shelters slept better. Those who hadn't still remembered that another option existed. Even cabins that stayed above ground were improved. People insulated floors better. They banked earth against walls. They built root cellars deeper and used them more often. All of it traced back to one winter and one barn. Samuel noticed something else as well. People began paying closer attention to the land itself. They watched how snow melted faster in certain places. They noticed how soil stayed damp or dry depending on depth. They spoke about the ground as something active, not just something to build on. The earth was no longer just dirt. It was insulation. It was storage. It was protection. Margaret felt the difference most clearly in her daily life. Before the shelter, winter meant constant tension. Listening for the fire to die. Waking to check the children's breathing. Measuring each stick of wood against how much winter remained. Underground, that tension eased. Days became quieter. Even hard work felt lighter when hands stayed warm and bodies stayed rested. She realized how much cold had shaped her moods without her noticing. Warmth brought patience. Stability brought calm. The children carried the experience into adulthood in different ways. Elizabeth remembered the shelter as a place of learning. She read more books that winter than any before it. Without cold driving her to bed early, evenings stretched longer. William remembered the stone walls and how they felt solid and safe, like nothing outside could reach him. James remembered nothing of sickness at all. For him, warmth was normal, not rare. Visitors continued to come even years later. Some traveled far after hearing rumors of a farmer who had lived underground through a Montana winter. Samuel welcomed them but never dramatized the story. He showed them the space, explained the principles, and reminded them that every piece had been built slowly, thoughtfully, and with care. He warned them against rushing. The earth rewarded patience, not haste. Not every attempt succeeded. Some people tried shortcuts. They dug without proper support. They ignored drainage. They misunderstood ventilation. Those failures reinforced an important truth. The shelter worked not because it was underground, but because it respected how underground spaces behave. Samuel never hid those failures. He believed mistakes taught as much as success, sometimes more. As time went on, new materials appeared in the valley. Better tools, better insulation, metal piping. Younger builders combined old ideas with new methods. But the heart of the shelter stayed the same. Depth. Massachusetts stability. Heat that moved slowly instead of escaping quickly. These ideas outlasted tools and trends. Old men who had once dismissed Samuel's work later spoke about it to their grandchildren. They told the story not as a miracle, but as a lesson. They explained how pride can blind people to simple truths. How tradition can become habit without thought. How survival sometimes depends on seeing what others overlook. The barn itself aged like everything else. Boards warped. Nails rusted. The roof needed replacing more than once. But beneath it, the stone chamber remained. Earth does not age the way wood does. It settles. It holds. It waits. Even when the shelter was no longer used every winter, it remained ready, unchanged by time. Samuel grew older. His hands stiffened. His steps slowed. But his mind stayed clear. When asked late in life whether he would do anything differently, he thought for a long moment before answering. He said he might have trusted himself sooner. He might have dug earlier, before fear nearly took his son. But regret was not something he carried heavily. He had acted when it mattered. When Samuel passed away, there was no monument, no plaque. But people still spoke of him when winter deepened. They spoke of warmth without fire. Of calm beneath chaos. Of a man who understood that sometimes the safest place is not higher, but deeper. Long after his name faded from memory outside the valley, the idea remained. Somewhere, someone would face a hard winter, remember the earth, and dig. And the ground, patient as ever, would offer its quiet warmth again. In the years after that winter, people often asked Samuel why he chose the barn instead of digging under the cabin. He always gave the same calm answer. The barn was overlooked. No one questioned what happened inside a barn. It was already built, already strong, already accepted as a place where work happened quietly and without explanation. That choice alone had allowed him to finish his shelter without interference, doubt, or argument. Samuel understood something important about human nature. Sometimes the safest place to build something new is where people are least likely to look. As seasons passed, the underground chamber became more than just a winter refuge. During hot summers, the children escaped the heat there. Food stayed cool longer. Milk spoiled less quickly. Vegetables kept better. Margaret noticed that even in July, the chamber stayed comfortable when the cabin grew stifling. Without planning it, Samuel had created a space that worked year-round. The earth did not only protect against cold. It softened heat as well. This realization slowly changed how people in the valley thought about comfort. Before, comfort was something temporary and fragile, dependent on fuel and constant effort. Now, comfort felt steadier, something that could be built into the land itself. Families began talking about shelter as part of the environment, not something fighting against it. Children who grew up after that winter accepted these ideas naturally. They did not see underground rooms as strange or frightening. To them, it was common sense. Warmth came from stone and soil just as much as from fire. When they played, they dug. When they imagined homes, they imagined thick walls and quiet spaces. The next generation did not have to unlearn fear of the ground. They were raised with respect for it. Samuel's quiet influence spread in small ways. A new barn built with thicker earth-packed walls. A cellar dug deeper than usual. A home partially set into a hillside to block wind. None of these changes were dramatic on their own, but together they reshaped the valley's approach to survival. Wood piles grew smaller. Chimneys smoked less. People slept longer at night. Margaret sometimes thought about how close they had come to losing James. That memory never fully faded. It softened her voice when she spoke to other mothers. It gave weight to her advice. She told them that warmth was not just comfort, it was health. That steady warmth mattered more than brief bursts of heat. That fear made people burn too much wood and still stay cold. Samuel's children eventually left the valley, as many young people did. But they carried the memory of that shelter with them. When Elizabeth married and settled elsewhere, she insisted on a deep cellar beneath her home. William became a builder and spoke often about insulation and mass, even when others dismissed it. James, who remembered warmth as normal, became cautious about exposing his own children to unnecessary cold. The idea followed them, quietly moving beyond the valley. Samuel himself remained unchanged. He still rose early. He still worked steadily. He still avoided attention. When visitors praised him too openly, he shifted the conversation back to the land, to the stone, to the simple truths anyone could observe if they paid attention. He never claimed credit for discovering anything new. He insisted the earth had always been that way. People just needed to notice. In later years, Samuel spent more time sitting near the barn than working inside it. He liked to feel the ground beneath his boots. He liked the quiet. Sometimes neighbors would stop by, not to ask questions, but just to sit. They talked about weather, about crops, about children. The barn shelter had become part of shared memory, something that belonged to everyone now. One particularly harsh winter many years later reminded the valley again of its value. Younger families who had never experienced the winter of 1887 suddenly faced shortages. They remembered stories told by their parents and grandparents. They dug. They reinforced. They stayed warmer than they otherwise would have. The lesson repeated itself, just as Samuel had always said it would. Time passed. The world changed. Railroads came closer. Supplies became more available. But winters did not grow kinder. The land remained what it had always been. And beneath it, the steady warmth waited. Samuel's health eventually declined, as all bodies do. On cold evenings, Margaret would guide him down into the shelter where he felt most comfortable. The stone walls still radiated warmth. The air still felt steady and calm. It was fitting, in a way. The place he had built to protect his family now protected him. When Samuel died, the winter was mild by comparison, but people still spoke of him when the ground froze. They did not speak of him as a hero. They spoke of him as someone who listened carefully and acted quietly. Someone who trusted understanding over tradition. Long after his name faded from daily conversation, the shelter remained. Children still played near the barn. New owners still discovered the chamber beneath it and felt the warmth rise as they opened the trapdoor. The earth had not changed. Only awareness had, and somewhere, in places facing cold, wind, and uncertainty, people would continue to rediscover the same truth: that the ground beneath their feet was not empty. It was alive with steady warmth, patient and waiting, ready to shelter anyone willing to dig, to think, and to trust what nature had already provided.